Hi everybody! I'm Pia from Stitches and Scraps. Welcome to Lunchtime Live. This is episode 39, and in today's episode I'm going to talk about working into chains versus working into chain spaces and when you might want to do one or the other and why. So that's what we'll talk about in our demo, but before we get there I have a lot of stuff to share with you, especially since we didn't have a Lunchtime Live last week. So Lunchtime Live, for those of you who are new, is basically my online version of a newsletter. Say hi if you're here so that I can talk with you and you can ask questions and we can actually, have a little chat. So it's for that. It's the social thing too, but it's also like a little video newsletter so you can know what's new with Stitches and Scraps. And then we end it every time with a little demo. So today's demo again is working into chains versus chain spaces. Now I'm going to be talking about lots of posts on my site and other links and products and things like that. If you want to see the link for any of the things I talk about, look in the description on this video and you'll see a link to a blog post. That blog post has everything I'm talking about today. So if you want more information or you want to see one of the patterns I show you, just go there and you can see all the links to everything that I'm talking about. And if I miss something, I'll put it there afterwards. Okay, so let's get started with what's been new at Stitches and Scraps this week. First of all, it is section 4 of our Simply Sweet Raglan Knit Along. This is the Simply Sweet Raglan baby sweater, and we've been working on it in 5 parts. So this is part 4, which means that we've got only 1 part left. So part 5 is going to be the sleeves, and that'll be the last bit. For part 4, we did the hem, and I know that doesn't seem like much because it's just ribbing, but part of that also is the bind off, and this uses a tubular bind off. Let me show you that down here. There we go. So this uses a tubular bind off that kind of gives you that seamless rolled edge. And that's the main part of the tutorial for part 4. And then I also threw in this part, I threw in the button and placing the button and how to figure out exactly where to put the button so you don't get any pinching or gaps. And the reason that I put that in here, honestly, is because there was space for it. There is absolutely no reason why the button has to go on before you do the sleeves. It just made sense tutorial-wise that, it's a little thing and there was room for it in this one. So that is the Simply Sweet Raglan baby sweater, part 4 of the knit along. So that was the first post. Now the other thing that I did in the last couple weeks is I redid this cowl pattern. This is the Impetuous cowl, and it's super, super easy, guys. There's nothing in here except for chains and single crochets, and then just this one little slip stitch seam here, which we looked at actually. If you look in a previous Lunchtime Live, we did a stretchy seam, and this is that stretchy seam. But this cowl, one of my favorites, it's been on my site forever and ever. I want to say like 4 years now, and I've made it at least a dozen times. It's great for charity. It's super comfortable. It's wonderful for spring. But the yarn I used originally was just stash yarn, and that's discontinued, and it was kind of a wintry look for a spring cowl. So I wanted to redo it. This yarn is from Knit Picks. It's called Shine Worsted. And now for those of you who don't know, Knit Picks and We Crochet are the same company. And We Crochet, Knit Picks, they sent me this yarn. I told them, look, I want to redo this pattern in a summery kind of spring-like yarn. So they sent me some Shine Worsted for free to redo this pattern, and that's what I've used. And I love these colors. It's like pale purple and green. And it also has, I'm forgetting the fiber content, but it's there in the pattern. It's not entirely acrylic. I want to say it's got some nylon in it, but I'm not entirely sure. It's got something else in it that gives it the shine, and it's really shiny. You guys, I love this yarn. It feels like I'm wearing an Easter egg, right? Like it looks like an Easter egg to me. I really love this, and I love the thing I love about this pattern most is that you can change colors wherever you want to. So I actually just did the green until I ran out, and then I switched to the purple. And that was as much thought as I put into the color change. But you can do multiple stripes, you can do one stripe, you can do whatever you want to, color block it, do all one color. It's a very, very versatile pattern. The other cool thing about this pattern is I included instructions for making it wider and longer, and alternate edging instructions so that if you don't want to seam it, you can leave it open and make it a scarf, or you can even make it really wide and long and make it a shawl. So you can do anything you want with this pattern. But this pattern was the prompt, I guess, that made me think of talking about chain spaces versus working into chains for today's demo. So we'll come back to this. The other thing that's been going on this week is I did a tutorial, actually last week, a tutorial for an invisible join when working in rounds. Now, the language here, people use these terms interchangeably, okay? There's two different things. There is what we did in our last Lunchtime Live, which is all the way up the circle, making a nice smooth seam. So I went ahead and called that a seamless join for that tutorial, for every single round making a nice smooth seam. But there's also a technique when you finish working in rounds, for your very last round, to finish that last round seamlessly so that it's completely invisible and you can't tell where the round started and ended. So that's what this tutorial is for, and I call that an invisible join. So don't get confused between the two. The terms get used interchangeably, but this one is for at the end of your work, right when you're finished doing it. And that's a really neat technique. I use that on almost all my amigurumi and even the fridge magnets, all of that. So that is up on the blog now. The reason that I didn't have a tutorial last week and that I kind of got behind is I was attending Creativation. Creativation is a crafting industry conference. It's not so much for crafters as for crafting professionals. So it's largely a trade show, honestly, but you get to see a lot of the new products that are out there. So this time was virtual, but I still got to see a lot of fun new products. So I have some fun new projects coming up. I'm going to be working with Art Esprit. I don't know if you remember them, but they make the sublimation markers so that you can do, sublimation ink just with your household iron, which is so fun. I had a couple projects with them already. I'm going to be working on something new with them. I also found some new yarns from King Cowl that I really want to try working with. One new one and one that's been around for a while, but I had some ideas for. So I'm going to have some projects coming up with King Cowl yarns soon. And then Clover has a couple fun new tools that I have gone ahead and asked for, so I'm going to show you those. And all of these are sponsored in the sense that I'm getting free product for them, just full disclosure there. But they are cool new projects that I found at Creativation and I want to share with you. So there may be a couple of other things coming up too. I've got a couple other things in the works. It was a great week of meeting new people and finding new products so that I can bring you more exciting stuff on the blog. So what's coming up for next week? And I see a lot of you are watching. Go ahead and say hi, you guys. Let's chat back and forth a little bit. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking and that's not as much fun. Okay, so next week, I have a roundup coming up, a collection of patterns. And the theme this week, or this time, is going to be baby, but it's not baby blankets. I'm not including any baby blankets because when you do a baby roundup or a baby collection, it almost always ends up being like mostly baby blankets. So I wanted to do all the other cute stuff, you know, bibs and hats and sweaters and mittens, those little tiny baby mittens, you know, all of that fun stuff I want to get included in this roundup. So I'll have some great patterns to share with you for that. I'm most likely not doing a new pattern of my own this week because I have some bigger things that I'm working on. There is a knit-along Cal that I'm participating in next week. So next week I should have, not this coming week, but the week after that, the first week of April, I should have a knit-along project for you for that. for the KAL Corner knit along. The current one that we are working on it's blanket squares, but I'm trying to remember what the name, I think it was like Sweet Summer Blanket or something like that, but it's a summer baby blanket squares that we're working on. So that's coming out in a couple of weeks. This week, no new pattern, but I do plan to put together a tutorial for single crocheting 2 together. So a single crochet decrease. I will have a new tutorial for that. And then next week for Lunchtime Live, I was thinking about doing a half double crochet 2 together tutorial, because there's a couple different ways to do it. You know, half double crochet has 3 loops for each stitch, and when you do 2 together, it kind of makes this big puffy cluster. So there's an alternate way you can do it that just involves removing a couple of those loops, and I'm thinking that's what I'll do next week. Unless you guys want to see anything different, you can always email me, message me, reach out to me however you want. Comment on the blog post, whatever works, to let me know if there's something different that you want to see at Lunchtime Live. This is for you guys, so let me know what you're looking for. And that, I think, is all the news I have for you today. Does anybody have questions on that before we go ahead and move into the demo portion? Anybody? Okay, let's go ahead and move into the demo portion. And today what I want to talk to you about is chains versus chain spaces. So here I've set up some chain spaces, and a chain space is made up of chains, right? It's chains on top of skipped stitches. If your pattern doesn't specify to work into the chains, if it says work into the chain space, then you're going to work into the chain space. And this is what this means. Don't go into any individual chain. You want to stick your hook right into the space, okay? Right there, and pull up your loop. So now you can see that my stitch is inside the space. It can actually slide around this space anywhere I want it to go. And that's a big feature of working into a space, because it's sort of like self-leveling. It will move to a balanced position. Now usually if I'm doing something like this, it's going to create these triangle shapes. And I want to show you on this cowl I'm wearing, you can see the sort of triangle shapes that form with those chains. See, this is a single crochet worked into a chain space, right? So keep that in mind. Working into the chain space is going to pull up on the center and create this triangle shape, okay? So when would you want to do this? Well, it's the default. If you're going to work into a chain space, even if you're putting multiple stitches in, like suppose I want to close off this chain space, a lot of people will just do, you know, here, let me do this. Double crochet, half double crochet, single crochet, half double crochet, double crochet. All worked into this one little chain space, right? And that kind of levels itself out and goes around the edge because I worked them all into the chain space, and it gives me this nice opening, right? So working into a chain is different. Instead of doing that, there are 5 chains here, right? Suppose I worked into each individual chain that same exact pattern. So instead of putting my hook into the space, I work into this chain. Now, just like working into a foundation chain, you can go in the back bump, which is my preference, or you can go into any 1 or 2 of these loops, right? So let's do this in the back bump. I'm going to go ahead and do a double crochet. Now notice this is a little less easy, right? Because you have to actually get into each individual stitch. So double crochet, half double crochet, move on to the next chain, single crochet, half double crochet, and double crochet. You know, I should have done that in a separate space because I want to show you the comparison. So I'm going to move on to this one, and I'm going to do the same thing but into the space. Okay, so now I have the same stitch pattern. This one is worked into the chains, and this one is worked into the space. I want to show you two aspects of this. First of all, this kind of gathers everything up, right? So that it's more curved, I feel like. It comes out more curved. It is a little more rounded. It's a little more, how do I put it? It's all kind of in the center, right? It's more centered. But this actually spaces it out better to get all the way to the edges. See how this leaves like a little bit of a gap here and it's not quite all the way to the edges? The other thing, the main thing that the reason you would do this is look at that nice bottom edge there, right? This has a very finished bottom edge. If I wanted to work into this later, I have an edge I can do that with, right? This one, it's much harder. I would have to start working in between the stitches or something like that to find a place to put my hook. So if I wanted to make a stitch here, I would have to go like here or here to do my stitch, whereas here I have actual stitches that I can work into to do a stitch. So where is this useful? Well, one of the big ones is thumbs on gloves. So this is a very old glove. I apologize. I just needed a sample. But you can see here this thumb opening was made by doing some chains and then skipping all of these stitches to make this thumb opening. Okay? So here is the thumb opening, right? Now suppose I wanted to crochet into this and build off a thumb. Well, luckily I worked into here. You can see I worked into each individual chain. So you have the bottom of a stitch here that you can work into. So I could pick up stitches easily all around this thumb because I have the bottom of the stitches to work into. And that's an important distinction if you're going to need to work into the circle. So this version I like for buttonholes. For some reason I just like the way that looks better. And this version I like for when I'm going to have to pick up the stitches to work into them later. The other reason for working into the chain rather than the chain space like this would be, remember I said here that this, it centers it, right? So your point of contact with this stitch ends up being in the center. Or if you have a different number of chains on one side, it might move to one side, but it's going to shift to a balanced position in the center and it's going to create this triangle. What if we didn't want the triangle? What if we wanted a different shape? What if we wanted two stitches but with a gap in between, right? Working into the chain lets you position your stitches wherever you want them. So I could go into the second chain and now look where my point of contact is, right? It gives me this sort of, it's still a triangle, but it's here and not here, right? And I could even make it a square if I did another chain here, say, and then went into the second to last chain. I guess it's going to be more of a rhombus than a square. But see, now I have 2 points of contact. So I can pull it up like that. And it's not even a triangle anymore, right? So if you want to be very specific about the positioning of your stitch, then you're going to want to work into a chain rather than into a chain space. So what are the other ways that we can work with chain spaces? We can work into them or into the space, or we can work into the chains. We can also work around, in front of, or behind the chain spaces. So let me get over to this chain space here. There we go. So suppose I wanted to work in front of this chain space. Well, I would come in and push the chain space back and then work my stitches. Notice that my hook and yarn and everything is in front of the chain space, and I can work these stitches that I skipped that are below the chain space. I can work those in front of the space. When would I want to do that? Well, there's a lot of fancy stitches that require that, or you can create this little ridge on the back, or suppose I wanted to work these stitches and then when I come back, and I actually have a pattern called Tryst that does this. I work in front of these stitches, right? And then when I come back around, on the other side, I actually drop down and pick up that chain space again. So now I've created kind of a design that floats on top of a fabric that's behind. So there's lots of reasons you might want to work behind a chain space or in front of it. To work in front of it, you would go here. You would do the same sort of thing, but make sure everything is behind the chain space, right? You can actually fold the chain space down into the front, out of the way if you want, and make sure your hook, your yarn, everything is behind the chain space. And this technique leaves that loop on the front. Okay, so when you want this chain loop on the back or the front, you can switch working in the front or behind the chain space. The other time this is used very frequently is with smaller chain spaces than this, just chain ones, is with something called intermeshing crochet or mosaic crochet, where you can create lots of cool patterns depending on whether you go in front of or behind, because going behind creates a horizontal line in the front, right? If I go behind this chain space, it pushes this line forward and gives me a horizontal line in the front. If I go in front of the chain space, and now pretend this chain space was smaller and just had the one chain, it gives me a vertical line in the front, right? Now mix that up with different colors and you can create patterns of horizontal and vertical lines of different colors. That is largely the technique of intermeshing crochet. Mosaic is similar, where you work one color, then you drop down and work the other, but in mosaic crochet, you're most often going to be working around the chain space. Now, it's really hard. People use different words. They'll say over or around. Sometimes it's hard to know what you mean when you say over. Do you mean in front of, or do you mean around, right? I will usually say, I'll usually add something in there saying like work around the chain space so that it is caught up within your stitches or something like that. And the way to do that is, remember when we worked in front, we made sure everything was in front, the hook came out in front, the yarn's in front, right? When we work in the back, we make sure everything's in the back, right? To work around it, we're going to mix the two. We're going to go in from the front, but then we're going to come out the back, right? So this yarn wraps over the chain space. So now we've worked around that chain space, and what that does is hide the chain space inside our stitches. If I did that all the way across all of these skipped stitches here, it would essentially cover up that chain space. And you may ask, why do we want to cover up a chain space? Well, mosaic crochet, the idea is that you put stitches where you want them to be seen and chain spaces where you don't want it to be seen. The chain space is just a way to travel to the next position. So you can work one color like this, and then, in traveling to where you want to go, and then put another color in on top just over the chain spaces. So that way you can get two colors in one row while only working with one stitch. Only working with one yarn at any given time. So that's mosaic crochet. So all of these techniques are just different ways of working over, around, into, on top of, in front of, behind chain spaces. And I think that covers all of the different techniques I wanted to talk about. The gist, I guess the takeaway from this is, if you're working with a pattern, be very careful about whether it says work into the chain space, or whether it says work into the chain, or in front of the chain, or behind the chain, or over or around the chain, right? That positioning is going to make a whole different look for your work. So if you're using a pattern, just be careful what you're reading. If you are making it up yourself, think about what you want the bottom of the chain to look like. If you want the bottom of the chain to be visible and workable, then you want to work into the chain itself. If you want to cover up the chain and have your stitches kind of floating and able to be moved around, then you want to work into the chain space. If you want to push the chain to the back, then you want to work in front of the chain. If you want to push the chain to the front, then you want to work behind the chain. And if you want to hide the chain and cover it up entirely, then you want to work around the chain. And that's different ways of working with the chain. So any questions on that before I say goodbye and log off for the day, let me know. I'm so glad you guys joined me. This was fun. And I can't wait to see you all next week. So thank you so much for watching, and I will catch up with you next week. And unless anybody has a different suggestion, we will be talking about an alternate way to do a half double crochet 2 together so that it's not quite so bulky. Thanks for watching. That's Lunchtime Live. Have a good Thursday, have a good weekend, and I will see you next week.